But in the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended, there was a huge amount of optimism in the United States about America's position in the world, about American foreign policy, and about the liberal international order. In fact, that optimism, I would argue, is reflected in John Ikenberry's classic book, After Victory. If you look at After Victory, which I would encourage you to do, John basically makes the argument that we have found the magic formula for making the liberal international order work for as far as the eye can see. And moreover, it's going to be a really happy time ahead. We're in the era of peace, love, and dope. Realism is effectively dead, right? The liberal international order is here to stay. As you all know, something went badly wrong along the way. Not in the 1990s, but it began to happen in the early 2000s. And 2016 was really the critical year. Two things happened in 2016 that indicated that the liberal international order was in serious trouble. One was Brexit. And then number two was the election of Donald Trump. I'm not going to talk much about this now, but it's very important to understand that Donald Trump ran against the liberal international order. He hated the liberal international order. He was elected in 2016, and absent COVID, he would have been reelected in 2020. And indeed, even with COVID, if he had acted like an adult over the past year, he would have gotten reelected. And again, he ran against the liberal international order. And then there's Brexit. And my basic argument is the liberal international order is history. It's over, folks. And my argument, as I'll make clear as I go along here, is that it was doomed from the get-go because it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Now, let me start off by defining what exactly the liberal international order is, because John and I have some differences here that are reasonably important. Then let me talk a little bit about the history of the liberal international order, and then go to the meat and potatoes of my talk, which is why it failed, why all that optimism has now turned into abject pessimism, and then say just a few words about where we're headed. Let me define the liberal international order by first defining what an order is. It's very important that you understand exactly what an order is. An order is basically an organized group of international institutions that helps govern relations among the members and helps those members deal with other countries that are not in the order itself. So an order is a compilation of institutions. If you think of the Cold War order in the West, right? We had NATO, we had the IMF, we had the World Bank. These were all institutions. And these institutions were cobbled together to form an order. And you also want to remember that institutions are basically rules. There's widespread agreement on that point in the literature. So orders are a conglomeration of rules. And the reason that orders are so important, the reason that rules are so important, is because in an incredibly complicated and interdependent world like the one we live in, you just need rules for states to deal with each other. If NATO is an institution and NATO is all about rules, what's going on there is that you need NATO so you have clear rules on how the members of NATO interact with each other, especially if they have to fight a war against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We are consigned to having an order of one sort or another for as far as the eye can see. Because again, we live in a highly interdependent and complicated world where we need rules. So institutions are rules, and orders are basically an organized group of institutions. Now, what about an international order? And here's where John and I have some disagreement. For me, an international order has to include all the great powers in the system to be international. Otherwise, it's a bounded order. So to get ahead of myself, when I talk about the Cold War order, the Cold War order in the West was not an international order because it didn't include the Soviet Union or the Soviet allies or China for most of the Cold War. It was a bounded order. And my argument is that after 1990, when we were in the unipolar moment and there was only one great power, which was the United States, obviously, we had an international order. So I distinguish between bounded orders, which don't include all the great powers, and international orders, which include all the great powers. Then, very importantly, we get to the word liberal. What is a liberal international order? I've told you what an order is, right? I've told you what an international order is versus a bounded order. Now let me tell you what I think a liberal international order is. The leading state has to be a liberal democracy. And indeed, you need a number of important players in that order to be liberal democracies, right? To have a liberal international order. Furthermore, you want to pay a lot of attention to the question of what are the goals of the liberal international order. There are basically three goals. One is obviously to spread liberal democracy all over the planet. If you want to have a liberal international order that includes every state on the planet, in an ideal world, every state would be a liberal democracy. Number two, you want to promote an open international economy, and you want to integrate every state into that open international economy. In a very important way, what you want to do is you want to get them hooked on capitalism. You want to create a lot of economic interdependence. And then thirdly, you want to rely heavily on institutions, and you want to integrate states, especially all the great powers in the system, into those institutions so that they become responsible stakeholders. They obey the rules. Remember, institutions are rules, right? And this is what we wanted to do with China and with Russia after 1990. We wanted to integrate them into those international institutions that existed so they became responsible stakeholders. Now, the final point I want to make, which has been implicit in what I've said up to now, in my opinion, you need unipolarity to have a liberal international order. If you have more than one great power in the system, i.e., if you have bipolarity or multipolarity, those great powers are going to compete with each other for security. You're going to get balance of power politics, realpolitik, and you can't have a liberal international order. You need unipolarity. Okay, now let me go to the second part of my talk, which is briefly talk about the history. And here I think you'll see that John and I just have a slightly different view of the history. John believes that the liberal international order was created in 1945 and existed up to at least 2017. Maybe he believes it still exists today. I believe that the liberal international order was created in roughly 1990. And what you had between 1945 and 1989 was a world that was dominated by two bounded orders that were realist to the core. One was an order that was dominated by the Soviet Union. It included institutions like the Warsaw Pact and Comecon on one side. And on the other side, you had a Western order, an order that was led by the United States that included institutions like NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, so forth and so on, that was mainly concerned with waging a security competition with the Soviet Union. So I believe that you did not have a meaningful, a thick international order during the Cold War. What you had were two bounded orders that were not international and were not liberal. Then what happens is that the Cold War ends and the Soviet-led order goes down the toilet bowl. It just disappears. It's gone. In fact, the Soviet Union is gone by December 1991. And we won. This is why we were so optimistic. And what we do then in the early 1990s is we take that Western-led bounded order and we expand it into, or we attempt to expand it into a liberal international order. And my point to you is we can do that. The United States could do that because it's the unipole. It doesn't have to worry about great power competition. By definition, there's only one great power in the system. So great power competition, realpolitik, is taken off the table for the United States, and it's free to pursue an ideological agenda, also known as a liberal agenda, and it's in a position to take that Western bounded order and turn it into a liberal international order. And if you look at things like NATO expansion, EU expansion, the promotion of the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, this is all part and parcel of our effort to take that Western order and make it into an international order, and not a realist order, but a liberal order. Because we don't need to worry about realism. We're the only great power on the planet. And what happens is that this enterprise is actually quite successful in the 1990s. John's book comes out, his classic book, After Victory, comes out in 2001, and John looks kind of like a genius. People are thinking that, he's really nailed this one. But as I said to you before, by 2016, the liberal international order is in real trouble. Now, what you want to ask yourself is what went wrong? And as J Mearsheimer said to you at the start of his talk, this whole enterprise contained the seeds of its own destruction. Now, what exactly do I mean? Let me point out 4 ways in which this enterprise was doomed from the start. First of all, it ended up turning China into a great power. The idea was, John talked about the liberal bet. The idea was that we were going to help China grow economically, make it prosperous, get it hooked on capitalism, make it really rich, and turn it into a responsible stakeholder. We were going to integrate it into institutions like the WTO. From a realist point of view, this was insanity. You will realize, all you midshipmen who are going to spend the rest of your life worrying about the China threat, that the foreign policy elites in the United States created this threat. Or let's put it differently, they helped create this threat. They created on purpose a really powerful China because they were betting that it would be a responsible stakeholder. Can you believe that? And their bet failed. And now we're facing Godzilla. No realist in his right mind would have ever done such a foolish thing. But anyway, the point is, we helped China grow. And the end result is we no longer live in a unipolar world. In fact, Vladimir Putin, who comes online in the early 2000s, basically resurrects the Russians from the dead. So now we're in a multipolar world. It's not only the Chinese, it's the Russians as well. My point to you early on, and you cannot underestimate the importance of this point, you cannot have a liberal international order in a multipolar world. You just can't do that. You need unipolarity. And furthermore, do you really think that China is a liberal state that's going to be happy with a liberal international order? I would not bet a lot of money on that, I'll tell you that. They have no interest in a liberal international order, right? So what we did with China doomed the liberal international order. That's point one. Secondly, we were heavily into the business of spreading democracy across the planet. And this got us, and it got the liberal international order into real trouble. First of all, we ended up fighting all these unnecessary and losing wars. And the amount of murder and mayhem that we're responsible for creating in the greater Middle East is truly stunning, right? And we get into wars in places like Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We're going to lose. We got into a war in Iraq. We lost. We made a colossal mess of Libya. We've helped make a colossal mess of Syria. We were really great at spreading liberal democracy in the Middle East. And of course, that's what the Bush Doctrine was all about. So we ended up fighting all these unnecessary wars that we lost. And that did a lot, as John pointed out, to discredit the liberal international order. Furthermore, we couldn't fight wars against China and Russia, but we tried to spread democracies into those two countries as well. And you know what? They didn't like it at all. You all know that the United States does not like the idea of the Russians interfering in our elections. The idea of the Russians interfering in American politics is anathema to us. Well, don't you think that the Soviets and the Chinese feel that the United States interfering in their domestic politics and trying to spread democracy and promote human rights in Russia and China is a violation of their sovereignty? That's exactly what they think. So this liberal international order not only led to these unnecessary wars in the greater Middle East, it also helped poison relations with Russia and China and gave them all sorts of incentives to undermine the liberal international order. Third, globalization. Globalization did a terrific job at wealth creation. There's no doubt about it. And it did a lot to help countries all around the world, especially China. That was my point before. And globalization made the American elite rich. John and I and Ed, we're all much richer as a result of globalization and what the liberal international order did. But there are huge numbers of Americans in the lower classes and even in the middle class who did not benefit from globalization, who did not benefit from the liberal international order. And many of these people are Trump voters. They are really angry. They're angry about the tremendous inequality, economic inequality in America, and they're angry about the fact they lost their jobs and can't find better jobs or new jobs. Right? So globalization, it might have helped China become a peer competitor, but and it might have helped people who are well off to begin with, like us, become wealthier. But for your average American, it did not do one whole heck of a lot. Then finally, there's the question of open borders. You want to understand that the liberal international order promotes open borders. The famous Schengen Agreement in Europe is a manifestation of this. The way liberals talk about the border with Mexico today, right? The liberal worldview trends to treat everybody as part of an international community and doesn't privilege the importance of borders and is open to all sorts of illegal immigration and so forth and so on. This is bound to cause trouble in a world where nationalism is a really powerful force. You see this reflected in the Brexit vote, and again, you see this reflected in support for Donald Trump. You cannot have open borders or anything approximating open borders in a world where the most powerful political ideology on the planet is nationalism. So all of these different factors came together. Globalization, the spreading of democracy, open borders, and the rise of China to doom the liberal international order. Now, the question is, where are we headed? My basic view as to where we are headed is that we're going to end up in a situation that is somewhat analogous to what we had during the Cold War. You're going to have an American-dominated order on one side, and you're going to have a Chinese-dominated order on the other side. And those two orders are going to be principally concerned with waging competition with each other. This is not to say you won't have a lot of cooperation inside each of those bounded orders. And note the word I'm using here, folks. It's a bounded order, a Chinese-led bounded order and an American-led bounded order. You'll have cooperation inside those orders, just as you had cooperation during the Cold War inside the American-led Western order and the Soviet-led Eastern order. But in terms of how those orders interact with each other, that's where the security competition will take place, as was the case during the Cold War. On top of that, you will have a thin international order. It won't be a liberal international order. That thin international order will include China and the United States and Russia, just as we had a thin international order during the Cold War that included the United States and the Soviet Union. But once you're in a world where you have two bounded orders that are engaged in security competition with each other, you're basically saying, in effect, that the liberal international order is no more. May it rest in peace. Thank you.